Okay, ladies, this screencast is going to pick up with the creation of states. If you have not yet downloaded the new updated Chapter 8 outline, you can find it on Moodle. It would be helpful for you, so you can pause the screencast and do that. But we will start now with the creation of states. We're going to go back in time a little bit to some events that kind of were happening at the Second Continental Congress and during the end of the Revolution, just to kind of continue talking about some of these political decisions that were made for the new American government when the war was being fought. So following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the colonies had begun to call themselves states. This highlights that they see themselves as separate and sovereign entities. Sovereign as in they hold the power of themselves. Kind of consider the structure of a confederation. This is the time in which they are under the Articles of Confederation. A confederation, if you learned in civics, is defined as a loose union of independent states. So even though they feel themselves united together and fighting for their overall independence within England, they do see themselves as like separate entities that they hold their own power like within their own state. So like they kind of make their decision for their state for themselves. And so new state constitutions are going to be created to kind of reflect their goal of doing things a little differently than what they had under England's control. So they all kind of start restructuring their governments, making new state constitutions in each state. And here are just some general characteristics of the newer state constitutions. They would have republican governments. So they would form republics. This is when the power of a government is in the hands of the people and not some supreme authority like a king or one single body. So they consider themselves to hold their own power. Another characteristic is we see the separation of powers in the states. This is the process of creating three separate branches of government. Now keep in mind, this is not happening at the federal level or the national level. This is not happening under the Articles for the U.S. government. This is simply within the state governments. There are three different branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And the emphasis was definitely put on the legislative branch. By far, that was the most powerful branch within the states. They don't want a strong executive, like single authority in charge and overall governor. It does vary somewhat from state to state, but overall we see the legislative branch as the most powerful branch of government within the states. And remember that the separation of powers idea comes from Montesquieu, who is a philosopher during the Enlightenment era. Another characteristic is we see representative democracy. And this is when people elected others to represent them and their vote in the lawmaking process. Like, it's not a direct democracy where they're voting for every individual issue. You are electing others to represent you in Congress or in legislature. Now consider that it's not really a true democracy in the sense that a lot of people aren't voting yet. Women aren't voting, African Americans aren't voting, poor, non-property owning white men are not voting. So there's for sure a level of non-democratic practice, but for the landowning white men, they elect others to represent them in their legislatures. The final characteristic of these new state constitutions is that there's overall religious tolerance within the states. They do place an emphasis on religion and importance on religion in society, but not any specific like denomination of faith. Not one denomination is inflated above the others. Okay, so now we're going to kind of talk about some of the problems that are happening within the states. And in terms of these problems, I went the wrong way. I have several kind of things here. Most Americans are going to start realizing that state constitutions had created like such weak executive powers that nothing's really getting accomplished. Shays' Rebellion really highlighted this. Y'all saw this in our documentary. So let's kind of break down some of the economic troubles that were happening in the states that is kind of depicted in Shays' Rebellion, that's showing an overall weak U.S. government. So the first issue in the states is that there's high inflation. Inflation is when you have too much printed money. Congress had kind of overprinted money during the war, which will cause the devaluing of that currency, so prices will skyrocket. Different states also, after the war is over, start printing their own currency. That just makes matters worse when you have different currencies floating around in the different states. So the states will be in an economic depression because of inflation in the immediate years following the American Revolution. Another economic trouble is that there was no national regulation of economic affairs. Currencies, tariffs, taxes, like the U.S. government has no control over any of those things. This means the states will be absorbing that control. They will be creating their own individual currencies and tariffs and taxes, etc. And that just adds to the economic turmoil of the era because it causes a lot of disorder and a lot of disorganization within commerce. The states find themselves in pretty severe post-war debt. They had borrowed money during the war. They're in debt now. Many states will respond naturally to being in debt with wanting to pass taxes, just like Massachusetts did in the Shays Rebellion conflict. Recall that the national government cannot levy taxes or pass taxes under the Articles of Confederation, but state governments can. So states will individually start upping their taxes. Well, poorer populations can't afford these tax increases, and because of that, many of them will be punished for it. They could be evicted, meaning, their property could be seized from them. Consider that action costs them their voting right because you have to be able to own property to vote at this time. So that's a lot more than just losing your ownership of property. It's losing your ownership of kind of voice in government. Another conflict, as we saw, or another risk, I should say, an implication, a consequence of not paying the taxes, many of these poorer populations will be jailed in debtor's prison because they couldn't afford taxes, which we argued was counterproductive to the overall issue. So we're going to see some of the poorer populations respond with protests and violence, just as the perfect example in Shays Rebellion was. But that's where that protest came from, and I wanted you to know that background on it. So all of these struggles are kind of highlighting the need for us to rework our kind of present frame of national government under the Articles of Confederation, begging for a change to be made so that the federal government can intervene and probably give some more assistance and be a little stronger and more stable. So just a quick recap of what our federal government looked like under the Articles. We briefly discussed it in the last chapter of Unit 2, but I wanted to make sure y'all understood what was going to be revised as we head into the Constitutional Convention in Chapter 9 later this week. So you don't have to type down everything in this chart. It just kind of gives you an idea of some of the weaknesses. I found it online, but this is what I need you to know about the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles, we had a limited central government, and most of the power and decision-making was reserved for the states. So the states are the overall power holder under the Articles, not the federal government. Under the Articles, Congress had no power to tax its citizens. This contributed to all of the national financial problems we just talked about. The Articles directly forbade sustaining a military force after the Revolution. So there's no standing military force that the U.S. government's in control of that could be able to prevent or fight back against the Revolutionary War, the rebellion, such as Shays Rebellion happening in Massachusetts during this time. So there's no standing military force. And one of the greatest weaknesses was that a unanimous vote was needed to amend or change any of the articles, anything in that initial constitution, or that initial written form of government. In this case, a unanimous vote means 13 out of 13 states would have to vote to make any sort of change to the government structure. That is about impossible. Y'all can imagine today, even if a law to be passed or if a change to be made required a 13 out of 13 or a unanimous 100% vote, you're never going to have every state agreeing with each other. Such as impractical, and it doesn't allow for anything to change or grow over time. So moving from here in the next chapter, we'll see some changes made to our present government structure to make it a little more stronger and a little more stable. And we'll save that for Friday. So please write down any questions you have, and I will see you all then.